The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content.
Why is everybody all of a sudden interested in resiliency? It's showing up pretty much everywhere. It's getting into the media. It's throughout everybody's political agenda right now. And most of it is tied to some staggering figures on property losses that I'm going to share with you. We all pretty much know what the disasters are. They're only disasters when humans try to interact with nature. If nothing was built here, it wouldn't be a disaster. It would just be Mother Nature doing exactly what she does. But it's that interaction, and we're the people who create the vulnerabilities by not building properly for these disasters. The disasters may not just be the primary event. There's also fires after disasters, hurricane, well, by the time it made landfall, Superstorm Sandy, 118 buildings burnt to the ground due to one single lightning strike. So we get these major conflagrations after the fires. After Hurricane Katrina, there was no water supply to the fire hydrants, so there were 9 fires that the fire department just had to leave unchecked, which means they just let them burn from building to building until they finally burnt themselves out following Katrina. An illustration of what that Superstorm Sandy event ended up looking like, that wasn't wind damage, that's all buildings that burnt to the ground. And then Katrina, and the sky was just lit up all night long with these unchecked fires. No place in the United States is excluded from disasters. This is over a decade, and every state has had at least 3 nationally declared disasters or emergencies. This doesn't count the ones that the governor declares. These are the nationally declared ones. So there's a lot of disasters that occur. There's something that should be addressed better in virtually every part of the United States. And let's see what's going on here. Thunderstorms, straight-line winds, and tornadoes. And from the 1960s to 2010, which is the last year I have full decade data for, 1,700% increase in property losses. This is huge. Tropical storms and hurricanes, 6,700% increase in property losses. Something is clearly going awry. Winter weather events, an 1,800% increase in property losses. Floods are not reported aggregately. The flood data comes from FEMA, where the other data comes from the Weather Service. So it's by event. But flood loss, the amount of flood loss claims has increased by 100%. And these are all in 2010 dollars. So this isn't just because it cost less back then. It's all brought up to 2010 dollars. And in fire losses, an 85% increase per fire. First thing people say, well, we're having more severe weather. There are worse events. Well, if you look at the statistics from the National Weather Service, the EF3 and the EF5 tornadoes, they're not increasing. That's the number of EF3s and E5s per decade, and these are the property losses due to tornadoes, straight-line winds, and thunderstorms. So something else might be awry. Hurricanes and tropical storms making landfall. That's relatively flat. This is not. So it's not the frequency of events. We presume, most people presume it is the frequency of events. Well, we're just getting more of them. No, we're not getting more of them. When we combine them all, I don't have flood in here because, again, FEMA doesn't report the aggregate flood losses. But overall, it's a 3,500% increase for all disasters, going from the end of the 60s at $5.3 billion 2010 dollars to $190 billion 2010 dollars in 2010. This is all based on the historic data. We do hear from NOAA and NASA. Their climate change models predict that there will be more severe weather. So if this is what's happening when we don't yet have the more severe weather, can you imagine where we're going to end up when we have more droughts and more wildland fires, we have sea level rises and more flooding, more storm surges reaching further inland, and we're not prepared. Buildings are built for 75 to 100-year life, and we're basing it on what used to happen. We're not even looking forward to what's going to happen with climate change when we're designing buildings. This is from the February edition of National Geographic. They took a middle of the road. They didn't take the highest sea level projections. They didn't take the lowest sea level projections. They took a 5-foot sea level rise by 2100. This is Miami. Nearly 100,000 homes will be underwater. And we're still building the new homes in Miami today without anticipating that this is going to be a 5-foot increase in sea level. So we need to start thinking about doing things differently. So what is it that is potentially happening here that's causing these huge increases in property losses? Well, the next thing I hear from everybody is it's demographics. It's the population shift. People are moving and living in more disaster-prone areas. Well, the Census Bureau data does not suggest that. It's an influencer. It has an impact. But clearly, these regional shifts in population aren't matching the slope of this curve of losses. So it's not population shift either. And as places become more populated, property values go up. When property values go up, we replace those low-rise buildings with high-rise buildings. As soon as we get the high-rise buildings, they're built to a higher standard than the low-rise buildings. These types of structures typically will withstand any kind of storm surge or wind events that are going to happen. They might get some superficial damage to them depending on the cladding system selected, but for the most part, the mid and high-rise buildings perform very, very well. So as the population moves to these areas, property values go up. You want to increase the population density. So as you increase the population density, you get high-rise buildings, and people are safer in the high-rise building. But all these people who are in these surrounding areas with these low-rise constructions are still vulnerable. So the population shift, even if it is a factor, is probably offset by what we do when people move to these more disaster-prone areas. It's clearly not the construction put in place. This is cumulative construction put in place for a number of residential units put in place. It's pretty much a flat line from year to year. It's the same number of housing starts. But again, that even when we looked at the cumulative number, it doesn't match the increases in property losses. So if it's not the frequency of events, it's not population redistribution, and it's not the amount of construction, that to me indicates that it's all tied to our societal trends. In the 1960s is when the business model of least initial cost, maximum return on investment, started to become adopted as the business model for almost every corporation in the United States. There were several efforts to try to counter that. You might recall that we went through in the 1990s total quality management, and prior to that we had Peter Demon and his work trying to increase value, but they weren't enough to stop this shift to drive everything to least initial cost. So what we have seen over time is changes in construction practice to meet this business model. This isn't about business people trying to do something intentionally wrong to increase the vulnerabilities of people, but it was just to stay alive in business. If you want to stay competitive, if everybody else is going least initial cost of investment, you need to follow that model to stay alive. You don't get a whole lot of options. This whole maximum return on investment, well documented by Dr. Michael Lepech from Stanford University, has really started to drive the increase in vulnerabilities. One of the best ones to look at for residential construction is in the 1960s, you used structural plywood on the outside of a 2x4 wall. In the 1970s, oriented strand board demonstrated to be comparable to structural plywood, so it was also accepted into the code. Today, this is 3/16 of rigid foam insulation on the wall, on the outside of the wall. So for most homes that are built today, you have a 1/2 inch of gypsum wallboard on the inside, 2x4 studs with bad insulation in between, 1/16 inch of foam board on the outside, and then vinyl siding over the top of that. With a box cutter, you could probably go through the wall easier than breaking down the door. We are no longer building resilient homes. There was a paper at the Structural Engineering Conference 2 years ago where in Missouri, there was a group of people who moved here from Florida, and they built their homes here in Missouri when they moved here, the same as they used to build them in Florida. Now, this goes back to plank construction, so that's what they were using when they got here, because they just knew that's just how you built homes. They happened to come from a hurricane-prone area, and they used diagonal planking for walls and floors. And when the tornado hit their town, it just picked up, they didn't know how to do the attachments to the foundation for the tornadoes, but it just picked up all these homes and just moved them off their foundations. It just picked them up, put them back down. They were still intact. There has been a dramatic change in the way things are being built. Part of this is because of government deregulation. This compounded the effort. Prior to the 1980s, most builders did not build to the local building code. They exceeded the building code because they didn't want to lose persons who could qualify for VA, HUD, Federal Housing Administration, Farmer Home Administration mortgage packages. So they built to these HUD criteria, or the Farmer's Home criteria, or some other government regulation. Well, these documents were designed so that the buildings would last for 30 years, or that was their intent, because they were insuring a 30-year mortgage on them. Well, in the 1980s, when we deregulated the federal government, these just simply disappeared. So it's left to the local building code. And in many jurisdictions, we don't even have a building code, at least a residential building code. So it created some more concerns. How do you get to least initial cost of investment? You build to minimum code. So what are we providing? A safe structure? A structure that reduces vulnerabilities? I don't think so. Minimum code doesn't imply anything about property protection. Minimum code is the worst building that can be legally permitted to be occupied. Things are spiraling sort of out of control. So what can we do? Well, this has become a major issue for communities. Communities are trying to figure out how to become more resilient. They know more Oklahoma can't continue to take these tornado hits. Coastal Florida can't continue to try to rebuild after these hurricanes come in and leave scoured slabs behind. What is happening? This has really been elevated. It's a national priority. There's presidential policy directives, there's presidential executive orders. There's an effort by the National Institute of Standards and Technology to set up a national framework for resiliency, which is going to tie in a significant component of that will be building codes and standards. FEMA has launched Resilience Star as a pilot program. So this is getting awareness. This is increasing in awareness. I participated in a program to educate staffers working on a bill for enhanced resiliency on December 2nd. I had to yield my time slot to Congressman Daniel Webster, because when the congressman shows up to talk to the staffers, Everybody else just goes and sits down. And his comment was, buildings should not fall down after a hurricane or any other disaster. Cool. They then invited me up to talk, and I just said what he said. I mean, this is what we should be doing. The people in Moore, Oklahoma said, this thing about affordability, it's not working anymore. You know, this build cheap up front, maximum return on investment is clearly devastating their communities. Now, they're not saying that we should build every home in Moore, Oklahoma to withstand an EF5 tornado, but if they're designed to withstand an EF3 tornado, which is fairly affordable to do, the peripheral damage to all the other adjacent buildings will be dramatically reduced and the community able to respond or recover better. So huge, huge opportunities. This is also, expect this also to become very, very political in the near future. This is percentages of government dollars, all government dollars. This is the percentage that comes from the feds. So 1955, a little over 5% of the government dollars used for recovery came from the feds. The rest came from the state and local jurisdictions. By the time we get the Superstorm Sandy, 80% came from federal tax dollars. Only 20% came from the state and local jurisdictions. So now we start having congressmen saying, well, wait a minute, my constituents live in Canton, Ohio. Why are we paying our tax dollars to people who didn't build properly on the New Jersey coast? It's wrong. There's a disconnect here. Why do my tax dollars? I live in a relatively disaster-free area in northern Illinois. There's an occasional tornado and occasionally some flooding, but very infrequent. You know, why are my federal tax dollars going to pay for, as far as I'm concerned, other people's stupidity for not building properly for the hazards that they're prone to? By going with sustainable construction, I'm a proponent that the first thing you have to have before you can call your building sustainable is a properly designed core and shell. Without having a properly designed core and shell, all those more expensive green features, whether it's low-flow plumbing fixtures or lighting and appliance controls that you add to your house to make it more sustainable, when the disaster happens, the disaster doesn't care. If you don't have a better core and shell, it ends up in the landfill like everything else. There is no, well, we'll go in and recover that. It's typically contaminated, or they need to remove the debris as quickly as possible. So there's no, well, let's go through and sort it all out, and we'll send the wood over here and the metal over. That doesn't happen after a disaster. So there are a bunch of voluntary programs. You'll be hearing about them later. The insurance industry has been promoting this since before 2000 with their Fortified for Safer Living. We have taken their criteria and combined them with some fire criteria, and that's the electronic handout that you should be able to download off the ACI website. There's the Resilience Star. Again, it's a voluntary program, but the voluntary programs are only good if you have the capability and the resources to influence the way your building is built. How many people here live in a custom home? That's a pretty good cross-section of what is out there. Most people, most businesses have no influence over how their homes or places of business are built. It's picked by location. You're not going to live 200 miles away from work just so that you could live in a better built building or an area that is less prone to disasters. So we can do this. It happens. They don't have to be concrete. Well, our recommendations just increase the loads, they change the code to just build buildings better. Concrete works well. Non-combustible exteriors work very, very well. This is stucco over a wood frame. These were all cedar siding and cedar shake roofs. Makes a difference. These were homes that were built to the IBHS standard. This is where homes that were built to the building code used to be. So it doesn't take that much. We should get this right because our society can't continue to support the aftermath of these events. Adding to the code modifications, 1 hour fire rated walls instead of this. This wasn't the building that had the fire. This is 150 feet away from the building that had the fire. This is just from low E glass on the neighbor's building, melting the vinyl on the other side. Wildland interface code already exists. Very few jurisdictions adopt it. Tornado shelters are easily incorporated into residential homes. Very few jurisdictions require them. Very few jurisdictions require any part of the structure to be resistant to missile impacts. We suggest increasing wind loads by 20%. Elevate construction above base flood elevation with at least a 3-foot freeboard. Avoid exterior sidings that are susceptible to hail impact as well as roofs. And we need to change the way government is handling these issues. Voluntary programs aren't going to work because most of us don't get to benefit from voluntary programs. Strongly encourage anything you can do to try to get this shift, like the NEHRP initiative. Collapse avoidance for earthquakes is synonymous with life safety. For all other disasters, we just say, get out. You'll return to a scoured slab, you'll return to nothing, but you didn't lose your life because you weren't there for the event. Now, I'm not suggesting that people should not evacuate when the event's coming, no matter how well their building is built, but we could do better if we treated other disasters like we did earthquakes. And I think people are finally starting to get it. When a cartoonist puts something in the paper, that tells me that it's starting to resonate amongst other individuals. So I think people are starting to get it. I think it's a huge opportunity for the concrete industry. So thank you.